Hey, hey. Good to go. Am I on? All right, members, welcome. Thank you. They tell me I'm on. Welcome here. This is our sixth Tally Talk. I see a lot of returning members here and some new members. So for our new members, this was started by Speaker Oliva when he was Rules Chair, kind of with this idea in mind. You know, many of us have robust conversations in committee rooms, on the floor of the House, which is great. We get into tough issues. What I think the Speaker's vision was to have these kinds of conversations in a more casual environment so that we can discuss big topics of the day. We can do it in a conversational setting, maybe outside the pressures of those other environments. And we've done a great job of having folks in education and healthcare and really all the topics that we deal with here in the legislature. As you all know, marijuana is a topic that has come up over the last couple of years in particular after a constitutional amendment that passed for medical marijuana. And we're in the midst of looking at a variety of different things during this legislative session. So we found out about Alex Berenson and his new book, Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. Alex went to Yale. He's got degrees in history and economics. He was first started off at the Denver Post and then went to thestreet.com covering Wall Street and corporate entities in Wall Street. Then went on to a 10-year career at the New York Times, which included 2 stints as an Iraq war correspondent during the Iraq War. About 2006 or 2007, he wrote his first novel, The Faithful Spy, which got accolades and awards. Now he does that full time. He writes novels full time.
Well, I was doing that full time
until this.
Yes.
Yeah. So until this book, which we'll of course he'll talk about a little bit, but this is his second book of nonfiction. So Alex, welcome to the Florida House.
Representative Sprowls, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So I told you all the title of the book, Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. Alex just did a press avail with some of the members of the press here in Florida. He said he forgot to hold up the book during the press avail. So I figured I would help him out a little bit. Alex, I was reading your book at home and preparing for our conversation, and I have 2 boys, and one of my 3-year-old came up to me, asked me what I was reading. I sort of told him, but not really. And I told him I was going to talk to the author. I said, I'm going to talk to the person who wrote this book and ask him questions. And I said, what kind of question do you want me to ask him? And he said, I think you should ask him what his middle name is.
Norman.
So I'll make sure.
My grandfather's.
Okay, so I'm going to tell him your name is Norman. But now that we got the tough stuff out of the way, let's talk about marijuana.
Sure.
And this is it's a provocative title. It's a kind of a provocative subject matter. Is this something that you've been interested in for a long time? And what got you interested in this topic you're going to write a book about it that's taken up so much of your time?
Sure. So first of all, I'd just say I don't envy all of you on this because you're in a difficult position because you're dealing with the effects of a 20-year lobbying campaign about on this issue that's led to a lot of misinformation, which I would say suffered from at the time I started researching this book. And the real reason I started, as I mentioned in the book, is that my wife is a forensic psychiatrist, meaning she deals with the criminally mentally ill. She was, until pretty recently, the director of forensics at a place called the Mid-Hudson Forensic Psychiatric Institute, which is in New York State. She would talk about the cases that she'd seen, and over and over again, she would say to me, well, this person was, high as a kite when he, stabbed his mother to death, or this mother, she smoked for, 10 years and, she gave herself schizophrenia and she, wound up throwing her kids off the roof of a building. I mean, terrible cases. These are terrible crimes. And I didn't have much opinion on marijuana, but, marijuana was not legal in New York State. I guess I'd probably used it a handful of times in college, and afterwards I never really particularly was interested in it. But I sort of thought, well, this is reefer madness. This is stupid. My wife's the one who sees the patients. My wife's the one who has the MD. My wife's the one who trained at Harvard and Columbia, so I probably should have paid more attention to her. And eventually she got tired of me pushing back, and she said, well, you should look at what the studies say, because I think they're pretty clear on this. And of course, she was totally right. The science around marijuana and severe mental illness is is extremely strong. It's been getting stronger, year by year, decade by decade. And unfortunately, the science around psychosis and violence is also extremely strong. And so, in some ways, so I was an investigative reporter for the Times for a number of years. This was an easy story to write from that point of view. I had the National Academy of Medicine telling me what I could and couldn't say. I had, dozens and dozens of papers outlining the issue for me. I didn't need to, find an investigative source to hand me documents from these companies. It's all in the open. And so to some extent, the book is half about the science. As I also like to joke, come for the science, stay for the true crime. But it's half about the science, but it's also about how we got to this place and the incredible job that the advocacy community, both the nonprofit and now these for-profit companies that have sprung up around this industry, because everyone thinks they're going to get rich, have done in misleading people about the science. And one of the great disappointments for me in this book in the last month is that the drug policy advocacy community has not engaged with the science. They've said because it's possible to say, okay, look, we know cannabis causes psychosis in some people. We know it has negative effects, but you know what? Alcohol's legal. We know alcohol can, do terrible things to people. Tobacco's legal. Tobacco kills hundreds of thousands of Americans a year. This drug can be legal, even for recreational use, but we're going to be honest about the risks. But they haven't done that. These people are, I hate to use the word lie, but there are people out there who are just lying about what the state of the science is.
I want to ask you a question about that, because you have this line in your introduction, and it talks a little bit about what you said about your initial thoughts on this. But it says, I mentioned when I began researching marijuana, mental health, and violence, I didn't expect much. I was wrong. On some level, what's strange is how obvious the link has been and for how long. You talk a little bit about the science, and I want to talk individually about the cases you make in the book about mental health and violence, but give us your conclusions, and then we'll go through the case.
Sure. So the broad conclusion is that marijuana is essentially a neurotoxin. THC is a neurotoxin. That it's certainly less physically toxic than alcohol, which is sort of in some ways the best comparison, but it's more neurotoxic than alcohol. It can cause paranoia. It causes paranoia all the time. It causes paranoia so often that in dispensaries they will advertise certain strains as less likely to cause paranoia. It causes psychosis, which is the term psychiatrists use for a break from reality. That's hearing voices, having hallucinations, having delusions. And when those delusions are about you being in danger, you personally being in danger, they become very dangerous because they make you scared and dangerous. Schizophrenia is sometimes called paranoid schizophrenia. Mostly that term has been dropped, just like manic depression has turned into bipolar disorder. But the paranoia is a big part of schizophrenia for a lot of people. It can cause temporary psychosis. That's completely clear. People who are administered THC, which is the chemical in marijuana that's responsible for its psychoactive effects, even in laboratory settings, even without a history of psychosis, some of those people will get paranoid and some of those people will get psychotic. And in fact, ethically, in laboratories, researchers will no longer give THC to anybody with a history of psychosis. You have to screen those people out if you're going to do studies on THC because THC is known to cause these symptoms. It clearly also causes or is associated with a variety of less severe conditions. So the other thing about psychosis, I should say, is schizophrenia is sort of permanent psychosis. That's one way to think about it. You have temporary psychotic episodes that can resolve on their own. Those are the things that, you smoke, you wind up in the ER for a night, with some paranoid fantasy or other. The doctor may not use the term cannabis psychosis to you, but on your discharge, on your billing form, that's going to be the diagnosis most likely. But for some people who smoke, it appears to cause permanent mental illness. It causes schizophrenia. And who those people are and why that happens are questions that, I think the science is we have a lot of work to do on the science. But if you look at the epidemiology, practically every study says the same thing. If you smoke as a teenager, your risk, depending on how much you smoke and when you start, and starting younger is definitely worse, is about 2 to 6-fold, a 2 to 6-fold increase in schizophrenia. The base rate of schizophrenia is about 1 in 150. It's usually quoted as 1%, but that's that number sounds round because it is round and it's not the real number. The real number's a little lower than that. So depending on what number you believe, we're talking about for an additional, if an additional 100 people smoke as teens, this might be 1 to 3 of them would develop schizophrenia, who wouldn't have developed it otherwise. And some of those people might have had subclinical symptoms. They might have had weird thoughts. They might, they're people who are a little bit odd, but they wouldn't have gotten all the way to this full-blown condition. And once you develop schizophrenia, the mind is the brain is a wonderful, organ. It's very resilient. But once you break it, you really break it. It's very, very hard to fix. And so marijuana can cause psychosis. It can cause schizophrenia. There was a study just published last week in JAMA Psychiatry showing that it was associated with depression. Teen use was associated with depression and suicidal ideation. Now, psychosis can also cause people to kill themselves. People get tired of hearing voices and they just decide they kill themselves. But depression obviously is also linked with suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts. There's evidence that it lowers IQ. That's disputed. I would say the evidence is not as strong. In general, there's strong evidence that marijuana use just isn't good for you in the long run. That it reduces your motivation. That it hurts your memory. That it hurts your job skills. That people who use a lot tend to sort of cruise through life. And look, that's a different argument to me. And people have said to me, advocates for marijuana have said to me, that's what you should have written about. You shouldn't be writing about the 1 or 2% of people who get psychotic. You should be writing about the 10% of people whose lives just stop. And I say to them, that's an argument for the drug? But so broadly, everything, basically all the stereotypes are true. Marijuana is a dangerous recreational intoxicant. It is not medicine. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be legal. That's up to you guys. But whatever we're gonna do with it, people need to know what the risks really are.
You talk about, in talking about the risks, you talk a little bit about THC and its impact. And in the book, you spend some time talking about THC and CBD and the difference between the two and why that difference matters in the studies that you read. So can you give us a little bit of a flavor for that?
Sure. So you can go into any grocery store in Florida, maybe not any, but you can go into a grocery store in Florida and buy CBD products. CBD is the primary non-intoxicating compound in marijuana. THC is the primary intoxicant. They actually look very, very similar if you look at the chemical structures, but THC binds with the CB1 receptor in your brain, and CBD does not. So CBD's gotten advertised for a ton of stuff, most of which there's not very good evidence that it works for. But it does work for some things, and it's actually been proven to work and approved by the FDA for the treatment of seizures in children, which is a great thing. That's a great benefit. But most people who are using marijuana recreationally don't care about CBD. They want THC. They want to get high. And the cannabis that you find in legal states contains now usually 20 to 30% THC and no CBD, practically no CBD. The ratio is about 100 to 1 now for most strains. And that ratio of THC to CBD has gone up over the last 25 years, precisely because CBD seems to counteract some of the euphoria that THC produces. So CBD may or may not be good for a lot of the things it works for, or it's said to work for, but it's really irrelevant to this debate. And the cannabis advocacy community has done a great job confusing people about this, because they go into the drugstore and they see, oh, here's CBD for my dog's arthritis or whatever. Marijuana must be fine, not realizing that what their kids or grandkids are using has no CBD in it. Now, if they're users, they know what they're getting. But if they're not, so one point I'd sort of broadly like to make is, people compare marijuana to alcohol in a lot of ways, but they're not alike in one. I mean, they're not alike in some ways, but they're not alike in one very important way, and that is, most people in this room, if this room is a reasonable subset of the American population, I never know with legislators, used alcohol last year at least once, and most people probably used it in the last month. About half of Americans had a drink in the last month. Marijuana is still much more marginal. Despite what you hear, it's a much more marginally used drug. Only 15% of Americans used marijuana in 2017, and about 10% of them used it once a month or more. its use is concentrated among a really heavy, a small but very vocal minority of really heavy users. So most people out there don't actually know, and only 50% of Americans have ever used marijuana, and most of those people used it at a time when it was much weaker. So people don't actually know what cannabis and THC are today. And they're sort of getting a lot of misinformation from the media and from advocacy groups. And so, again, this is why the CBD thing is so confusing. And you will find, I suspect, if you talk to people you know who've used cannabis in the last couple of years, you will not have to go far to find somebody who says, wow, that was totally different than it was when I did it in college. Like, I did not think that I was going to have the experience that I had.
Give us context for that. So, obviously there's a significant marijuana movement in this country in the 70s towards really not medical marijuana, towards legalization or decriminalization. So you mentioned a moment or two ago that people are smoking marijuana recreationally that could have up to 20% THC. Give us some perspective. So if someone now is smoking marijuana in a recreational setting and it's 20% THC, or in a medical marijuana setting at 20% THC, how did that compare to the average marijuana that's being smoked in 1973?
In 1973, the average marijuana sold in the U.S. was about 1% THC. And significant CBD, and that number is from it's from the Schaefer Commission in 1972. So it's really interesting. The Schaefer Commission was sort of the first national effort to look at this, and the book they put out, the report they put out, is called "Marijuana: A Symbol of Misunderstanding." And so advocates draw on that book and they say, well, this says marijuana wasn't very dangerous back then. And it does say that. But what it really says, if you read it carefully, is marijuana had almost no THC in it. So you really had to work to get high. I mean, it's like trying to get drunk drinking near beer. If you really wanted to do it, you could do it. But most people, this is why, and looking around this room, there may have been people who smoked in the 70s. There's a lot of people who report, I didn't feel anything. No, you didn't feel anything because you had 2 puffs of something that was 1% THC. This stuff is and by the way, we're not even talking about the most popular, what's becoming the most popular form of marijuana use in this country is not even flower cannabis. In other words, what the green stuff you see, it's a semi-synthetic product called either butane hash oil, honey oil, wax, shatter. This is stuff that is created by running CO2 or butane through leaves to extract the THC. Then you purify this product by removing the butane or the CO2. You're left with the sticky substance that you can smoke. This doesn't even. I mean, this is not a plant. Okay. I love it when people say this is natural. This is about as natural as heroin. It is. I mean, it's slightly more natural than that but not really. I mean, it's a semi-synthetic product, and really on the continuum, it's got as much in common with K2 or spice as with 1% cannabis in terms of the way it's going to light up your brain.
So, in your book, I want to move to mental illness specifically, because you build a case through the book that talks about studies, and kind of to set the stage for that, you mentioned, look, there's 150 years worth of cultural or studies dealing with this issue. What are some of the most compelling evidence that you found around mental illness and marijuana?
So it's fascinating to me to look back. There's this. The British in the 1800s set up these asylums, mainly for Indian Army soldiers, and this is. Like all colonizers, they were bureaucrats and they kept records. And they noticed that a lot of the people who were showing up at the asylums were blaming what was called ganja in India for their illness. And they actually, as early as 1870 or 1873, took a look at this. And then they took another look at it in the 1890s because, and it's amazing, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. They were worried about opium and cannabis in 1890. The British had a huge problem with opium, and they were selling it to the Chinese like crazy, but they were also using it a lot at home, and they were concerned about cannabis. And so they set up this commission that was really it's actually an amazing bit of scientific work, and they looked at 3 levels of cannabis. Actually, there's something called bong, which was essentially the 1% stuff. And then they had something called charas, which was like hashish, which was about 10%. and there was something called ganja, which it's interesting that even back then people knew that the way to make more potent cannabis was to kill the male plants, and the female plants pollinate with THC, and so you get this high THC resin that people can smoke. So that stuff was more like 5 to 10% THC, which obviously less potent than what people have today, but still much more potent than the ditchweed that and so people then were aware that when you used when you used ganja or charas, that you were much more likely to have these symptoms than when you used bong. And so when the doctors looked at who was coming to their asylums, they found that 20 to 30% of the people who showed up in the asylums were blaming cannabis for their insanity, or their families were blaming cannabis. And that was much more than opium, it was more than alcohol, it was more than any other drug. It's amazing to me that 130 years ago, there was evidence piling up about this. Then you sort of fast forward to 1987, a Swedish psychiatrist named Sven Andresen published the first really big paper looking at 50,000 Swedish army recruits, and he looked at their tendency to develop schizophrenia following whether or not they were using cannabis, and he found that people who used more than 50 times in adolescence had a 6x increase in schizophrenia diagnoses. Now, you have to control for that because people who use marijuana are more likely to use other drugs. You also have to control for a family history of mental illness because that's also, that's a clear component of schizophrenia. But even after he did all that, he found that there was almost a 2+ increase in likelihood of developing schizophrenia for people who use more than 10 times in adolescence. And this finding has been confirmed over and over again in peer-reviewed journals. And that's why the National Academy of Medicine in 2017, and that's really, that's the foremost scientific body in the United States, said after looking at this for more than a year, they had a 16-member commission, they had a staff of, I think, 13 full-time paid. They wrote a report that was almost 500 pages, and the takeaway on cannabis and mental illness is cannabis use is likely to increase the risk of developing schizophrenia or other psychoses. The higher the use, the greater the risk. That's their words, their language, the first conclusion in that paper about mental health.
I know that some of the conversation around the findings in the 2017 and your work in the book, people mentioned, well, it's difficult to get that kind of data in the United States. Can you talk to us about maybe other countries around the world who maybe do a better job collecting data and what the challenges are around us trying to potentially measure whether or not there's a connection between marijuana and psychosis?
Sure. So in the U.S., this is basically unmeasurable right now. We don't even know how many people in the U.S. have psychosis or schizophrenia. And the most amazing sort of factoid on that is that in November 2017, without making a public announcement, the National Institutes of Mental Health suddenly cut its estimate for schizophrenia in the United States from 1.1% to 0.3%. And they just changed it on their website. They didn't tell anybody. And a schizophrenia researcher, one of the top schizophrenia researchers in the US, wrote this scathing piece about this. And he said, wow, they just cured 2 million people with schizophrenia. Isn't that amazing? And so the head of the NIMH said, well, we actually don't know how many people in the US have schizophrenia. And that's absolutely true. We have no idea. We're not good. I can tell you basically how many people got cancer last year. I can tell you how many people are living, after heart attacks in the US. Mental health data is very protected, as it should be. But there's no registry. I mean, some of you may have noticed, by the way, that the U.S. healthcare system in general is in a bit of a crisis right now. We're not very good at, collecting data about mental health. And so when people say, one of the things that the advocates say is, well, there's no real evidence. Cannabis use has gone way up in the West in the last 20 years or 30 years, and there's no evidence that schizophrenia diagnoses have increased. That is true in the US because there's no data on schizophrenia diagnoses that you can count on, or really that exists at all. It is no longer true outside the US. One of the things that I mentioned in the book is that in Finland and Denmark, which are two countries that have national health care and they have sort of very good track of their populations, there has been an increase in schizophrenia diagnoses in the last 20 years. And in both those countries, cannabis use increased quite a bit in the 90s, and potency increased as it's increased everywhere in the world, since about 2000. So the increase is not huge. It's not large enough that it would be notable in the U.S. The U.S. would have no way to track this, but it's about in Denmark, I think it went from 1% to 1.3% for schizophrenia diagnoses. And in Finland, it went from about 1% to about 2%. And there may be other reasons for that. There might be better mental health outreach in those countries. There are other possibilities, but what you can no longer say, what the advocates are saying that is now demonstrably untrue, is that there's no evidence of population increases.
So what about, that's mental health, I mean, what about, violence, right? So one of the things you kind of hear in the mainstream is, look, unlike alcohol, which could make some people, could make some people violent, could make some people happy, right? That marijuana is something that makes people more relaxed as opposed to violent. People who smoke marijuana, they don't get violent. And you seem to maybe think that the evidence suggests otherwise.
The evidence does suggest otherwise. So in controlled settings, laboratory settings, there doesn't seem to be much connection between marijuana and aggression. And again, that may be because because those settings are screening out people who have any history of psychosis. So let's talk about alcohol for a minute, right? Anybody who's ever been in a bar at 9 p.m. and gone back at 1 a.m. knows that alcohol disinhibits people, right? And it causes arguments to escalate to fights. It causes fights to escalate to people breaking chairs over each other's heads. There's no question about that. Alcohol can cause violence. It can cause physical violence. It can cause sexual violence. It causes violence. But at the same time, I'm sure everybody here also knows you can have a glass of wine at dinner and it doesn't make you go crazy. And you can, you may even know somebody who's got a problem with alcohol, but who just sits at home drinking and watching TV until he passes out. We know that about alcohol. We know that alcohol can cause violence, but that it doesn't cause violence in everybody or most people. I don't understand why that's a complicated thing to realize about cannabis, especially because the violence that cannabis causes is different than the violence that alcohol causes. So yes, plenty of people smoke, and don't have anything happen to them, as people like to say to me, the only thing I attacked was a pizza. Sure, but if you are psychotic, okay, or if you have some pre-existing mental illness, let's talk about those people first, okay? If you're using a drug that makes you paranoid, it's really dangerous, okay? And the evidence on schizophrenia and violence, on psychosis and violence, is brutally hard for people to accept. People who are schizophrenic have about a 20 times increase in their homicide risk as people who are healthy. 20 times, okay? Even though less than 1% of the population in the United States has diagnosable schizophrenia, schizophrenics account for somewhere between 6 and 10% of all the homicides committed in the United States, and that number might be an underestimate. People with diagnosable psychoses account for about 20% of all the people in prison in the United States. All the people who say that our prisons are filled with the mentally ill are correct. The flip side of that is the reason they're in prison is because they've committed violence most of the time, or much of the time. So if people, I was on the Joe Rogan show, which some of you may have heard of last week, and he said, marijuana makes me paranoid, but it sort of makes me existentially paranoid. I'm thinking about that we're on a rock that's circling the sun, and we're all going to die one day. And just sure, but the paranoia that people have when they have pre-existing psychosis is not that. It is the cops are out to get me, or my mother is poisoning me, or my child has been replaced by an alien. Okay, it is horrible, bizarre thoughts that lead people sometimes to do horrible, horrible things. And one reason that this crime doesn't get the attention that it should have for the last umpteen years is the crimes are so brutal, and usually there's no mystery about who did them. It's people with psychosis rarely try to hide their crimes, and when they do, they usually don't do a very good job of it. They just get relegated to the tabloid pile, and so they've just, unless sometimes law enforcement is involved. When a police officer gets killed, there's sometimes more attention paid. But when it's the mother literally throwing her child off the roof, Nobody wants to talk about that. And we don't want to deal with that woman either. We want to put her in a mental hospital and forget that she ever existed. I totally understand that. But the violence is real. These cases are real. So there's a really, the book draws on a number of studies showing that people with psychosis are at very high risk for severe violence when they use cannabis. Now you can say, okay, like that, we can't legislate on the basis of half or 1% of the population or 2% of the population, and that's your choice. Like again, that's not what I'm here to talk about. But what I will say is that there are studies showing broadly that cannabis use is a broad risk for violence in the overall population. There aren't very many because not very many people have looked at this, but there are. But the book has at least I would guess a dozen. And they're sort of drawn from all over the world. And what they show is that the risk for cannabis violence, or the risk for violence among cannabis users, is at least as high as the risk among alcohol users.
What about, I mean, we care about, obviously, crime rates. Any legislative body across the country cares about those kinds of things. And one of the things you hear is, we talked about violence and the conceptions there that you think are wrong. What about, has there been comparisons done where you've said, okay, here's states that have legalization, and people will say, well, look, the violent crime rate's going to go down because they have legalization. Is that what you found?
No, that's clearly not true. If you look at aggravated assaults and homicides in the first 4 states to legalize, and you compare 2013 to 2017, there were 450 homicides in those 4 states in 2013. There were about 620 in 2017. Based on the city data I've seen from Denver and Seattle and Spokane and some of the other big cities, I suspect that delta is going to increase. If you compare that to the U.S. violent crime rate or the U.S. homicide rate, per capita, homicides went up about 30% in those 4 states between 2013 and 2017. In the U.S., the increase was about a little bit under 20%. You see similar trends for aggravated assaults, which are a much broader base of crime. There were about 30,000 ag assaults in those 4 states in 2013. There were 38,000 in 2017. Again, it looks to me like that delta is likely to have increased in 2018. Look, we can't say that legalization definitely caused that increase, but what you can say with certainty right now, and maybe in 5 years, maybe we'll look at California in 5 years and say, oh, Berenson was totally wrong about this. But what you can say with certainty right now is that the people who've told you that legalization is going to, end the black market and give cops the chance to, focus on serious criminals and do their jobs and reduce violent crime, that violent crime is going to go down, those people are wrong, and they need to stop saying it because it's a lie.
Nope. One of the things that I think probably every member in here is working on, or certainly their constituents are facing, is the opioid epidemic and the opioid crisis. And we've all heard stories from our constituents, maybe people we know or family members who've been addicted to opioids, who've lost their lives, and it's an epidemic. And one of the things that we all try to do here is solve problems, right? How can we solve this problem? One of the things that has kind of been entered into the conversation around marijuana and opioids is, listen, legalization of marijuana, for medicinal purposes or for recreational use will help us alleviate this crisis that we're in the midst of. Is that an assumption that you challenged in the book?
Yes, it is. Here's a fun fact, by the way. California was the first state to legalize medical marijuana in 1996. What is not well known is that Arizona also legalized in 96. There was a medical marijuana initiative. That initiative was never put into place. The reason is it didn't just legalize marijuana, it legalized all Schedule I drugs, including heroin, LSD, yep, true story. And the legislature refused to approve it. And after that, the medical advocates got smart and they never tried anything like that again. They always said marijuana is different. But the nexus between the people who are bringing you medical and recreational marijuana and the people who brought you widespread opioid use in the 90s and the aughts is real. Okay, so when these people say medical marijuana is a solution to the opioid crisis, they are talking out of both sides of their mouth. Now, people say, is marijuana a gateway drug? And the answer to that question is unequivocally yes. There's generations of evidence showing that, and talk to anybody who runs a treatment center. People who use cannabis often go on to use other drugs. Now, can you say one reason that might be true is, well, if you're buying from your friendly local dealer, that person might have heroin or cocaine in their backseat too. Would you like some of that? And the answer to that question is going to sometimes be yes. Okay, so that is actually an argument for legalization. Let's move it away from those people. However, it's equally likely that using intoxicants that are addictive primes your brain to want other intoxicants that are addictive. So that essentially marijuana pharmacologically gets you ready to use other drugs. And there's some evidence, preclinical evidence, and sort of rat data and stuff like that showing that. It's also possible that people who use marijuana are just risk takers generally, and they're the same people who like to drive 100 miles an hour, and the same people who use other drugs. So to that extent, it's a gateway only because it comes first. So I think all those things might be true, but the idea that marijuana could be a solution for the opioid epidemic, the idea that giving people an addictive intoxicant to get them away from another addictive intoxicant is a good idea, nobody seriously considered this possibility until about 2014 when a paper came out in JAMA Internal Medicine, and it had some state-level data that basically, I wouldn't say it's been discredited because the data is accurate, the finding in the paper is accurate, but I would say more recent data shows essentially that the effect that this paper found was not correct. So what the paper found was states that legalized medical marijuana had lower rates of opioid overdose deaths. Okay, the real reason for that, probably in the early years of the epidemic, was that the states that legalized medical marijuana were all in the West. And the opioid epidemic, as you well know, was started in Appalachia, jumped to Florida, and then went nationally. So since 2010, the opioid epidemic has become a national crisis, and medical marijuana has gone national. And so you would expect that if this were a real finding, it would have been confirmed since then. But in fact, it's gone away. If you look at more recent data, there is no link between opioid deaths and states that have legalized, or that have legalized medically. Further, there is good data from a paper that came out in 2017 and got no notice, because this is how this works. The data that shows, to my mind, the truth and the stronger data doesn't get noticed because it doesn't have an arsenal of people pushing it. But this paper showed that individuals, and if you want to track changes in behavior, the way to track that is by tracking individuals, okay? Not tracking states. Individual data is the best way to go. And by the way, if you want to argue that about my crime stuff, that's the best way to push back on it, in my opinion. But so if you looked at individuals, people who were using cannabis had about a 3 to 4x rate of opioid use 3 years later as people who weren't. And that is after looking at confounding factors. So you start with cannabis, you wind up with opioids or cocaine or methamphetamine. In the 70s, one of the reasons that legalization or decriminalization came to a halt was that marijuana use became associated with cocaine use. Cocaine use went way up in the U.S. in the late 70s. There's a little show called Miami Vice in the early 80s that took note of this. And parents saw their kids using pot and then a couple years later stepping onto cocaine. And it is amazing to me. It is a brilliant job by the advocacy community that they have flipped this on its head and said, well, you know what? The U.S. has the worst opioid crisis in the world. The U.S. and Canada, the two countries where cannabis use is the largest. But guess what? Cannabis is a solution to this epidemic. The fact that they have made that case and haven't been pushed back on is a complete failure of my old profession. Okay, when this story gets written in 10 years or 15 years, the New York Times and the Washington Post, these places are going to have a lot to answer for.
You end with the New York Times, Washington Post. You've obviously been out talking about your book. I watched the radio program you were talking about the other day, and you mentioned on the program about kind of the interaction you're having with the media or lack thereof. Was it surprising to you? I mean, what has been the reaction from kind of the mainstream media on the arguments you make in the book?
So the book came out. It got a fair amount of press the first week it came out. Malcolm Gladwell wrote something nice about it in the New Yorker. By the way, I don't know Malcolm Gladwell. I gave him a copy of the book a few months ago, and he decided what he was going to write about. I've never even met the guy. I got a couple op-eds in the New York Times and in the Wall Street Journal, but it's been fascinating to me. So the Washington Post hasn't written about this book. The LA Times hasn't written about this book. Most of the big papers in cannabis legal states have ignored the book. And partly that may be because they are all in the business of selling coverage about the industry to to lawyers in the industry and entrepreneurs in the industry. They sell it for $200 to $2,000 a year. And I would hate to think that that influences their broad coverage decisions, but I can only tell you that the places that don't do that are the places that have covered the book. The Philadelphia Inquirer's covered the book. The Chicago Tribune, somebody wrote about the book. But so there's been a really interesting pattern to me about what's happened with this book. And the advocacy community, they've pulled out all the stops. They've accused me of being racist. Which psychosis and schizophrenia, those are afflictions that don't know race, okay? And the harm that I hear about from people, it's mostly, from suburbanites who've lost their kids, because those are the people who, they have money and they even when their kids, wind up institutionalized 3 or 4 times, they keep fighting and they keep spending money. It's not because anybody cares any less, but because at some point this becomes exhausting for a lot of families. But they've said that I don't understand the difference between correlation and causation. I mean, that's what the whole book is about. I hope everybody gets a copy, or everybody who's interested gets a copy of the book, because the book is its own best advertisement.
Let me ask you this. I want to get to questions to see if any of the members have questions for you specifically. But you realize we've talked about kind of where we are in this marijuana discussion. If you had advice for us over the next month or so, what would be your advice?
My number one bit of advice would be if you feel you have to do this, if you feel this is what the public wants, this is what I understand there's this issue with the amendment, get as much data as you can. Get data on these users, get data on what happens to them, get data on their outcomes, get data on the child death data that Florida has collected that shows a massive number of the people who were using drugs at the time their kids died, either from abuse or neglect. Almost all those, the number one drug of abuse, and it's not even close, was cannabis. Drill down into that. Drill down into admissions at psychiatric hospitals. Some state is going to do this. Colorado's done some of it. The data from Colorado, for example, shows that suicides where the person had THC in his or her blood at the time of the suicide increased 4-fold between 2006 and 2016. But even Colorado hasn't done as good a job as it needs to. Get the drug driving data. Spend a few $1 million and start blood testing people. Blood test everybody who's arrested for a homicide in the state, and see what drugs they were using. It is amazing that the U.S. is moving to legalize this drug without any real data on its harms.
Questions? Representative Roach.
Thank you, fascinating. One thing you don't ever hear about is thank you. One thing you don't ever hear about is any studies that look at the level of toxins or carcinogens in marijuana cigarettes. And I think culturally we've done a very good job of stigmatizing tobacco use, even among youth. But is there concern about carcinogens in marijuana cigarettes as well?
So great question. I don't deal that much with the physical harms of marijuana in the book. I mean, the non-psychiatric harms. For whatever reason, there hasn't been strong epidemiology showing that marijuana use causes cancer, lung cancer. And the NAM study goes into this. It may be because it's so confounded by cigarette use, because so many people who smoke also smoke cigarettes. It may be because people tend to use less. You're not smoking a pack of cannabis cigarettes a day. And one reason I think smokers like the super high THC stuff is they don't have to inhale as much of it. So the data on physical health risks isn't that strong. Interestingly, marijuana can cause heart attacks. That's clear from the epidemiology and from the fact that it changes your blood pressure. So that's a real risk. But whether the lung cancer risk or the asthma, other lung risks is severe, I think it's open to debate.
Thank you.
Representative Zika, and then Chair Burton.
Thank you. And first and foremost, thanks for coming. I'll be ordering the book today. And this is a new topic to me as a member of the House. And so it comes up a lot. So the first things I've done is I've started researching data in Netherlands, which they have been on the forefront over the last few decades. It's interesting to see that last several years there's been a movement on recalling some of their policy around the subject drug. So I would love your thoughts on that. Someone is kind of early in the process learning. So thank you.
You're absolutely correct. They have, the Netherlands, moved to decriminalize in the 70s, largely I think because of this argument that we want to separate cannabis from other hard drugs. And it's been increasingly clear in the last 5 to 10 years that the Dutch are frustrated, that there's a lot of cannabis tourism. They get, there's sort of minor violence, not, the crime rate in the Netherlands is not huge, but, there's minor psychosis and some violence associated. People sometimes say to me, well, it's legal in the Netherlands and, their jails are not filled with murderers. And that's true. But it's also true that even though it's legal in the Netherlands, the rate of use by the Dutch is significantly lower than the US. The Dutch are, they're generally sort of reasonable people and they don't have a huge problem with use by their own citizens. They have seen some of these societal downsides, and they are beginning to push back against use. So I think, and by the way, France, Germany, they're right around the Netherlands, Britain nearby. Those countries have all had an opportunity to see the Dutch experiment up close. And guess what? For 40 years, they have not been pushing to legalize cannabis or even decriminalize it. One of the things the advocates will tell you is that, and this has been just another great successful bit of myth-making, is that the US is an outlier in terms of its laws on cannabis. They're absolutely correct. We are an outlier. We have some of the most liberal laws on cannabis use in the world. And those countries have gotten to see the experiment up close, and they haven't used it. And by the way, even if you look at arrest data, when you adjust for use levels, it's not clear to me that you're more likely to be arrested in the US for possession or use than you are in European countries.
Great question. Chair Burton.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. We had a presentation in a committee regarding suicide rates here in the state of Florida, which we've seen an increase over the last decade, if not more. And is there a similar correlation between marijuana use and suicide rates as there is between marijuana use and mental illness?
There is, in that, use has risen substantially in the U.S. in the last 15 years, and suicidality has risen in the U.S. in the last 15 years. I don't think that anybody can say, in this case, and I get accused of saying, confusing correlation and causation. I don't confuse it. In this case, there's correlation. I don't think that you can say there's causation. You have an opioid crisis. We have the financial crisis. We've had, we've had sort of a general. We've had a lot of problems in the U.S. in the last 10 or 15 years, and so I think that there's a lot of potential causes for that. I would say that if marijuana is as good for people's mental health as everyone says, it's interesting that this use doesn't seem to have helped mental health broadly. And one other bit of data, and this is a data point that has gone unnoticed. There's something called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. It covers about 70,000 people, annual survey. It's our sort of best data source on mental health. It shows that rates of serious mental illness doubled in people 18 to 25 in the last 10 years. Those people also have had the highest rates of cannabis use growth. In kids 12 to 17, there hasn't been as big an increase, and there hasn't been as big an increase. There's been almost no increase in either marijuana use or self-reported rates of mental distress. And in people 25 and over, there's been some increase in marijuana use and some increase in reported rates of mental distress. Now, again, these are big pots of people, and you can't say correlation. You can't say that correlation is causation in this case the way you can with schizophrenia, where it's it's a much smaller group that you're looking at. But by the way, there's very few things that cause schizophrenia. Genetics cause schizophrenia about half the time, 40-50% of the time, and the rest of the time we just don't know. It's a sort of pot of factors. But I would say the numbers you're pointing to are right, and they're worrisome.
So in addition to being, of course, a reporter, an investigative reporter, an author, you're also a dad, right? The title of the book is Tell Your Kids. I know you're like me, you have young children,
Yes.
So probably a little young for this conversation.
Yes.
But as they get older, when you're going to give them their fatherly advice on marijuana, what do you say?
Please don't use this. So I have a 6-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy, and my wife is pregnant again. Apparently we don't have enough to do in upstate New York. please don't use this drug. If you're going to use it, please don't use it until you're in your 20s and your brain is fully developed, or almost fully developed. It's not safer than alcohol for you in your teens. It's a dangerous drug. It's not just because it's a gateway to other drugs. It's a dangerous drug in and of itself. It's not medicine. I mean, that's what we need to be doing is figuring out how to warn people about this. I mean, whatever happens with legalization, and I think certainly if a Democrat wins in 2020, there'll probably be full national legalization. But whatever happens, we need to be honest with people about this. And it's been so disturbing and frustrating to me that the drug policy advocacy community has been unwilling to engage on this. And by the way, now that there are for-profit companies in this, if you expect them to be honest about this, I mean, where have you been the last 100 years with tobacco? I mean, people who sell an addictive substance are not going to tell you the truth about whether it's dangerous or not.
Alex, this is a super important time for us and an important topic. We appreciate you taking the time to come and join us and tell us about your book.
Chris, thanks so much for having me.